Grice's Maxims. This is part of the pragmatics paper or chapter, and it's quite relevant in terms of the next chapter as well, which is discourse analysis. So we're going to go over those maxims. This has to do with conversational organization, and that's a lot of the topic of our discourse analysis chapter 11. But this is still like formally in the pragmatics section, but it has really a lot of relevance because it has to do with conversation and interaction between people. And in conversation, we tend to think that, okay, we have all these rules for grammar, for instance, that we have to order the elements in a phrase and in a sentence in a certain kind of a manner in order to be grammatical from the native speaker point of view, and in order to communicate. And that's what we tend to think about language rules, and then we of course think about those rules that have no relevance for our being able to use language, the punctuation rules and the kind of stuff that you learn in freshman composition, what is proper language and so on. But those are like rules of behavior, and then the rules of grammar are the ones that we don't have to be taught, we acquire them when we are growing up. But those kinds of rules are the rules that we tend to think about overtly, more overtly, especially the punctuation rules. But we don't typically think about the fact that conversation is also rule governed. We tend to think that people just come together and start talking, but and we do it typically following the rules. But we do notice, we don't always follow the rules, and we do notice that there must be a rule because sometimes something goes wrong and because a person violates some sort of an unwritten, unspoken rule of a conversation. What rule am I violating now?
Awkward silence, I guess?
Yes,
yeah.
The silence was too long. All of a sudden, in the middle of my being in charge of this class, my being in the role of giving the lecture, if I fall silent for too long, then it's against the rules of conversation, because if you're holding the conversational floor, it means that you have to hold it by talking, and that can be violated. If I fall silent, it pretty much means that I'm giving up the conversational floor to somebody else. And if we were to have continued that little silly experiment, ultimately you would have said, Dr. Halmari, is there something wrong with you? And a sudden case of amnesia or what have you, and it is because it's against the rules. Of course, in classroom, the conversational rules, they are unwritten, but everybody seems how to follow them. We very rarely have situations where the students intentionally want to take over the conversation without being assigned the role. And how do we assign the role? Send the message that I'm giving up the conversational floor now to somebody else. What do we do?
What you just did.
What I just did, ask a question. And that means I'm giving up my turn, my discourse turn, I'm giving it to somebody else. And asking questions is thus it's not only a cue to signal that I'm stopping to talk now, it's also, it has this, the person who asked the question has this quote-unquote power to assign the next speaker and then also to assign the topic. What are we going to be talking about? And usually the question requires a relevant topic. So anyway, there are these unwritten rules of conversation. Now they differ from culture to culture slightly, and when we talk about intercultural communication, we'll notice that the intercultural differences in conversational rules may lead to negative stereotypes. We think these people are just jerks if their conversational rules are a little bit different, and then we feel entitled. It's human nature that the way we do conversation is the right way of doing conversation, and then we rarely think about the fact that somebody else's way of doing conversation is perfectly fine from that particular culture's point of view. There, you don't have to go to people from another culture, like from a different country or from a different region in the United States, but we know that within different regions of United States there are different ways of talking. Some people talk more, some people talk more slowly, some people talk more quickly, some people tolerate more interruptions and overlapping speech, or interruptions is a loaded term because overlapping speech, which we have already mentioned earlier, overlapping speech can be interruption, but it can also be this benevolent back channeling, like, you show you are listening, you show you are understanding what the other person is saying, you show that you are agreeing with the other person when you send these back channeling cues. And back channeling cues can be verbal or non-verbal. What you were just doing, nodding your head, is sending me the message that you're listening. And I'm not talking to a wall. so
I know, I'm noticing that I'm doing it.
so they're really important. And of course they have to be different in the telephone conversation. We have this totally new field. Telephone conversations have been studied to quite an extent, but we have this new field of communication, online communication, via different kinds of media, and Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, whatever. Not Spotify is just for music, isn't it?
I think you can message users on there. I think it's mainly for sharing music, though.
Right, yes. So you have this messaging thing, and we have these electronic means of communication today, and people have started to study them and the rules that underlie the electronic communication, and that would, again, I'm adding to the long list of topics that people could do for the project at the end of this class. This could be something that you could do. You could do a little study of social media rules. How do you, for instance, get out of a chat, and so on. We have these Zoom meetings. What are the rules for Zoom meetings and people? Because this is kind of like thrown upon us without being able to really prepare for it. So all of a sudden everybody has to have Zoom meetings and there are no written rules. Very likely there wouldn't be any written rules for Zoom meetings in general, but sometimes you kind of like, I just last Saturday moderated a Zoom webinar with over 200 people, and we then kind of make it explicit, or it kind of has become an unwritten established practice that all the questions come as part of the written chat, and then I moderate the questions, because if we have 200 people asking questions, then it becomes very easily chaotic, and somebody might take too much time, and somebody might present a question that perhaps is a little bit off topic, and so on. So there, people kind of acquire these unwritten rules really quickly, and then they seem to be fine with them. One particular person asked in the beginning of the webinar, are the cameras off intentionally? And then, you just have to address that, because that's another thing in the Zoom meetings. What are the rules? Do we see each other? Do we not see each other? And and so on. So there are these unwritten rules, and we know that a rule is broken if we have this feeling that the conversation is going into the wrong direction, or something is uncomfortable, something is strange. Like if there is too much interruption in a conversation, or overlapping speech, too much overlapping speech can be an indication of interruption, and then that can define the conversation as a quarrel. On the other hand, there are cultures, and the linguist, sociolinguist Deborah Tannen has written about this, that there are cultures within the United States which tolerate a lot of overlapping speech because it's co-construction of the conversation. One person says something and the other one, before that person has finished, is kind of like, pitching in and supporting what the other person is saying. And that's normal in those conversations. She points out, especially the Jewish communities, especially in New York, that there is a lot of overlapping speech which everybody expects and everybody tolerates. But then if you have people who behave like this interactionally, and Deborah Tannen comes from that background, so she knows it, and then she's a linguist, and she became just really kind of an advocate of the fact that intercultural differences in conversational styles may lead to negative stereotypes. So if we have somebody who tolerates a lot of overlapping speech speaking with somebody who does not tolerate overlapping speech, then in that particular culture, then we have some kind of a clash which may lead to negative stereotypes. And those are really interesting things. My point here with this introduction is that there are rules of conversation. Who begins the conversation? It's kind of like an unwritten rule again. When I walk into my class, I am supposed to begin the conversation. If a student begins, it's usually kind of like framed somehow. How would you frame if you want to say something to me when I walk and you have something you need to ask or make?
I would usually be like, hey, can I talk to you after class? It's kind of rude to talk before class, because then everyone's kind of waiting for you to finish your conversation.
Okay, yeah. Wait after class. Okay, that's interesting. Yes, and verified by 25 years of doing this, that it's true that students come after class. Sometimes they come before the class, and it is true. It kind of like, oh, I have to get started. So it's kind of like, can you come after class? We'll talk about it after class. Yeah, that's a good observation. Yes, and everybody, when you are in these conversations that are not pre-planned, when you run into people, how we construct that conversation, it is based on a lot of experience from everybody who is part of that. And for little kids, we sometimes have to kind of we have to guide them, wait until the adults are done speaking. So that would be an overt rule, which children then learn pretty quickly. So by the time they go to school, they have pretty much internalized that particular rule already. They they can't talk when the teacher is talking, or they will, but that's again, it's a sign that something is not going according to the expectations, and then you have to have these measures of what to do with the children who talk during class. And I've taught, high school, so I know that that's something that does happen. It's against the quote-unquote rules, but of course, when you're a high school student, you want to rebel against all the rules, so including conversational rules. So those are fascinating things. But now to Grice's Maxims. Grice was a philosopher, and he, at the time when he formulated his Maxims, he wanted to make explicit the observation that we all have made, that there are rules for conversation, for normal conversations. And this he titled the Cooperative Principle. And the Cooperative Principle, it then includes these 4 maxims that we'll talk about. So the Cooperative Principle, in short, it just means that when people come together to communicate, they follow the principle that according to which all the participants in the conversation try to benefit or work towards the goals of that conversation. So everything you do in a conversation is supposed to build towards the goals of the conversation in a cooperative manner. Now, this does not mean that people, when they talk with each other, they wouldn't disagree, because disagreement is part of just being human. But how to disagree in a conversation, it may be one of the goals of the conversation is that we want to discuss something, like for instance politicians, when they come together in a meeting, they have to discuss something and then make a decision, and disagreement is a part of the process that everybody needs to express their views so that we get a holistic idea of what we should decide and then vote, perhaps. So cooperation doesn't mean that we are all like, yes, you are right. That's not what it means. It just means that we have this subconscious knowledge of what the conversation is supposed to achieve, and we all work towards that goal. Like for instance, during the lecture, we know that we have gone through considerable trouble to get into the auditorium, or get to the video lecture and listen to the lecture. But anyway, if we think about that's a little bit different, because then you are not so intimately part of the conversation. But if you are here in the same space, we know that part of the goals of us coming together in this particular venue is that you learn about one of the chapters of the book, one of the topics of the book. And part of that understanding is that I am to give a lecture about it because of the circumstances. This is more of a lecture than a seminar, with more conversation included. But part of that, so we all kind of know, okay, that's the goal, and in order to get to that goal, part of the events during or episodes during the lecture might be that there's like open questions. Does anyone have any questions? Even if it's not framed formally like that, you can ask a question, and that also furthers the goal of our being together here cooperatively I would then give the best answer I could, and we are all working towards a better understanding, in this case about Grice's maxims. Okay, so this is a cooperative principle, and it consists of 4 maxims. And the first maxim is the by the way, this is H.E.P. Grice, and just to give a time frame of his life, 1913 and 1988. And so this is not like a really recent thing, but it's not ancient either. And it continues to have relevance. Of course, he has been criticized for some things, like people say, okay, people don't always cooperate in conversations. They don't. And the point is that we know that when somebody is not cooperating, then a rule of conversation has been broken. So, okay, so what are the maxims? They are the maxim of quality, the maxim of quantity, the maxim of relevance, and the maxim of manner. And some of them consist of sub-parts. So let's start from the maxim of quality. It's basically don't lie. So that would be like, we paraphrase it like that. And the first part of this, we can break it down into 2 parts. Don't say what you believe to be false. So I wouldn't walk here into the auditorium and start lecturing falsehoods about pragmatics intentionally. So I might sometimes say something that is not fully accurate, and I have to look at Grice's dates because I don't have them memorized, and I might make a mistake on something like that. But I wouldn't come here intentionally to tell you lies about pragmatics, and you know that we trust each other in these conversations. If we think about a situation here on campus that you need to go to the post office and you don't know where it is, so you would stop someone here on the mall and say, do you know where the post office is? And the person says, yeah, it's over there. And you trust that person. So you don't, the first thing you say, you think is that, is he telling me the truth about where the post office is or not? Of course, we trust each other, and we don't even give a thought about the falsehoods that people might be giving us in every single encounter here during our days. So basically, don't lie. Don't say what you believe to be false. So intentionally, we shouldn't be doing it. According to Grice's maxims, of course, people lie all the time, and that's not what Grice wasn't naive in thinking that all people follow this. No, the point is that when someone lies to you and tells you that the post office is over there, if it is over there, then something's wrong. That's not the expectation. Something's wrong in the discourse. Something's probably wrong with that person. Okay, the second part of the maxim of quality is don't say that for which you lack adequate evidence. And if we stick to our where's the post office on campus example, what do people usually say if you ask, so where's the post office, and you happen to ask it from some other student who isn't sure?
I haven't really asked anyone for directions, but someone asked me, and it's my first most around campus, so it was like, I have no idea, let me pull up a map. So I pulled up a map and then showed her.
Exactly. You admit that you have no idea, but then you follow up and then you say something that you believe to be true because it's on a Google map or whatever map you use. So yes, so we typically frame if I say, do you know what time it is? And you don't have your phone with you where you could check or watch if you are old school. You would say, oh, I have no idea. I think it's about 5, but I don't have my phone with me, or I don't have a clock or whatever. So, or watch. So we frame it, we kind of send a message that here's the information I have, but it may be false. So that's just, how we are. And if somebody says with, confidence that it's 4 o'clock and it's only 3:30, that makes a difference, and that would be considered strange. Some people say that there may be cultures where people, in order not to lose face, the positive face, that in order not to appear ignorant, some people may avoid giving the accurate information, or they may give information to a question, for instance, that is inaccurate, but they say it very confidently. I am not sure how that should be studied more, but you may have met some people who speak confidently about things that they know nothing about, and that's, in a sense, it's a violation against Grice's maxim of quality. Don't tell lies, or things that you don't for sure know whether they are true if you don't have adequate evidence. So the maxim of quantity is then the next maxim, and it also has 2 sub-parts. And the first part is make your conversational contribution as informative as is required. So give as much information as is required in a particular interaction. But it has then the opposite part also, which says don't make your contribution more informative than is required. So don't make your contribution more informative, and the other one is make the contribution as informative as is required. So this means that there is some kind of an ideal amount of information that we should be given in each particular conversational exchange. And in the lectures, if we start from this here and now situation, the conversational contribution is, the overall conversational contribution is formally defined by the time that is allocated for the class. So if I go over like 5 minutes, students are extremely sensitive about the fact that now this is too much information, it needs to be condensed. If I miss 20 minutes from the beginning of the class, it means that it's too little conversation. But it's quite rare that we have formally defined allocations of time for conversations. In informal conversations, naturally occurring conversations, these rules still apply. So let's take a concrete example. By the way, these are in the notes on Blackboard. So if this is just like scribbles here, you will find all these in the pragmatics notes. So let's take an example of the maxim of quantity, how it works in a real life situation. If if you are if you meet somebody and you go for coffee with that person, and you know that this is like on the first date or whatever, and you know that the question of children will come up, and I've got this elaborated there in the notes. If you say, if you have, like, for instance, 7 children, and you know that the question of children will come up, so somebody asks, so how many kids do you have? And this is a potential partner whom you haven't met before. And if you say, I've got 2 daughters, and forget the mention of the 5 sons completely, then that means that is not enough information. Because it's relevant information if you are interested in, romantically in somebody. It's relevant information if you have 7 children, and saying that you have 2 sons, 2 daughters, not mentioning the 5 sons, is not lying, but it's not giving enough information. So it's not against the maxim of quality, but it's against the first part of the maxim of quantity. The opposite would be if you to that same question, do you have any kids, if you explain everything about your kids, like their names and their middle names, and not only their ages but their birth dates, and which day of the week they were born, and their birth weights, and what their preferred foods are, and going on and on and on. That would be the violation against making your contribution more informative than is required, right? So it's a fine balance, and in a way it's a miracle that we typically kind of are able to gauge, okay, have I said too much or have I said too little? So sometimes we formally ask, did that answer your question? Sometimes people say to you, if you haven't provided enough information, could you elaborate on that? Could you give an example of that? And so on. But we all know people that may be violating the second part of the maxim of quantity. You know that if you run into someone, it's like, okay, the next 15 minutes I'm going to be standing here and listening to this person because they go on and on and on and on, and there's no end. They just tend to love their own voices and have a lot to say, which is too much information. And we have this phrase, too much information, or TMI, which specifically refers to these situations where people give information that is not required. And it's usually somehow like, too intimate or whatever, so we don't need to hear that. Do you have any comments? Have you had?
I feel like on the topic of kind of like not giving all the information, I feel like that's kind of a lie. I think it's like called a half-truth now.
Yes.
But I feel like by omitting the fact that you have like 5 sons as well, that's kind of like not right, you know?
Exactly. And it is again, you know, we know that this is not enough information, but Grice put these maxims, kind of like made this analysis, and it's not against the truth maxim, the maxim of quality, but it's against the maxim of quantity. So it's not enough for us to be telling truthful things, but also taking into consideration how much information is required by each particular situation. So, it is interesting. We have a very strong understanding that there's something wrong in a conversation if a person is not giving enough information or is giving too much information. So, maxim of relevance is very simple. It's basically be relevant. So if I ask you a question, could you define pragmatics, for instance, and you define nuclear physics? Then that's not relevant. But it doesn't have to be that striking always. We know exactly that, you know, that wasn't relevant. It's interesting, by the way, in these lecture interactions sometimes that, you know, you have a big auditorium full of students and you ask a question and somebody says something that is not relevant. So it's kind of like, how do you point that out without hurting anybody's feelings? And also, you know, when we are interacting with people whom we know well, we can say, that wasn't what I was asking. Can you answer my question? And then, you know, we can kind of do that, and we'll talk about the courtroom in a moment. But you know, if you say something like, hi, how are you doing today? And you say, I am planning to take a vacation next week. That may be relevant, and we have this brings in the conversational implicature that we kind of always struggle to make even an answer that doesn't sound relevant to be relevant for the question. Like, for instance, if I'm asking, how are you doing today? I'm planning to take a vacation next week. We interpret that, even though, like, ostensibly, seemingly, it doesn't seem relevant, but it typically is relevant somehow. That I am doing well because I'm not going to be working next week. I'm going to wherever, and Disneyland, and so I'm doing well. So we struggle to interpret things, and that has to do with conversational implicature. And sometimes these things kind of like enter the picture, especially the maxim of relevance. If you ask, I think the good example is that if you ask, do you know if Mary is dating anyone nowadays? And the answer is, you say, or your friend says, she's been going to Houston a lot recently. By conversational implicature, it seems to be irrelevant to whether Mary is dating anyone or not, but we interpret it so that it is relevant, and that's the intention usually by the person who says it, because the person doesn't necessarily know if Mary is dating someone, but if she says, she's been going to Houston a lot, and then of course the tone of voice can help the interpretation to make it relevant, so we kind of, okay, she's seeing someone in Houston. So it's interesting, but sometimes there are totally irrelevant answers. Politicians are really good about giving irrelevant answers, and then they get very briefly or quickly corrected, like, that wasn't the question, could you please answer the question, address the question. In press conferences and what have you, a lot of people, journalists, they ask questions, and if it's an uncomfortable question, then you try to address something different, and then in these kinds of situations, if the other people feel comfortable saying that was irrelevant, nobody says that was irrelevant. They would say, could you answer my question? My question was, I'll repeat my question or whatever. It is a confrontation, but people make these attempts to avoid answering questions that are uncomfortable. That's, part of communication. We sometimes are in those situations. Okay. So be relevant, that's relatively straightforward. The last one is the maxim of manner, and it has actually 4 different sub-parts. Avoid obscurity of expression, avoid ambiguity, be brief, and be orderly. So these are part of the maxim of manner, and obscurity. Avoid obscurity of expression. We do this all the time. People do that all the time. Going back to politicians, if they are asked something they don't really want to address, they may be saying something really, really obscure that is vague, and so on. Avoid ambiguity, that your answer could be interpreted in more than one way, and that would not be cooperative either. So be brief. It kind of overlaps with the maxim of the first part of the maxim of quantity, but no maxim of the second part of the maxim of quantity. Don't make your contribution more informative than is required. But it also means that in interactions we shouldn't be just too long-winded. Say what you want to say, and say it in a concise manner. Be orderly. Like for instance, if somebody asks you for the instructions of how to get to the post office, you start from where you are, like from here you turn to the right or to the left, and then when you come to the intersection, then you take the right, and then the post office is on your left. And you don't start like, when you take this intersection, the post office is going to be on your left, and before you get there, you will take the right turn, and so on. So you don't do it. So that would be the logical, orderly manner. Now the maxim of manner, it also applies, like for instance, academic writing or any writing. Don't be obscure. Don't be vague. somebody may have sometimes received an academic essay back with a note on the margin, vague, be explicit, avoid ambiguity. If you, for instance, use a relative clause so that the antecedent of the relative clause can be more than one noun phrase previously, then that's ambiguous, and it's not good writing. Be brief. Sometimes you've got a word count, but even within a sentence, students try to relatively recently taught freshman composition, and I noticed that students have a word count the minimum count of words that the essay needs to be, the length, and they tend to want to add a lot of words. If they can say it with 3 words, they want to put 7 words into one sentence. Yes.
So I have a problem with that too. I've been trying to work on it and be more clear and concise, but I noticed when I was in high school, like, a lot of my English teachers were like, oh, you need to fluff up your essay and make it longer. And I was like, why? So they would teach me to put in, like, more adjectives or something like that when it wasn't necessary.
Yes, and like, for instance, a very simple example is the use of very, which I just used. Like, this is a very interesting question that I'm going to address, and it doesn't make interesting any more interesting if you have very in front of it, because it's become this empty thing. Yes, in high school, the students often need to be prompted to fluff and be more explicit, add more description, for instance, then you add adjectives and so on. But then that can be taken too far. And then students come to college and they think, the more words, the better. But it's not true necessarily. So sometimes being brief, being concise, being exact, especially, if you're writing about science, even if you're writing an English essay, being exact is, in a way, is a virtue. And your knowledge, you have more knowledge now than you had in high school, so you can add that knowledge there, which means that you have the substance and you have enough words to make the word count, minimum word count. Of course, be orderly. In academic writing, it's very important that you present things in a logical, orderly manner. But that's an interesting point that may be why very often the freshman writers, they put a lot of words into the essays when you could just be more concise.
Yeah. Like I've noticed in like my peers' writing, and sometimes even in my own, like sometimes we say like due to the fact of instead of just like because, and it's unnecessary.
Exactly. Yes. And yep. Yes. And people have this false idea that the previous one, the first one, would sound more academic, but actually also the overuse of due to, and I love the fact that you point out that because covers a lot of ground.
Yeah.
And due to used to be even marked as, because due to is supposed to be in front of according to the old rules of grammar, prescriptive rules, in front of a verb phrase, like the train is due to arrive at noon. But due to the arrival of the train at noon, everybody was at the station. Due to in front of a noun phrase was, for not that long ago, considered stylistically bad. So I really appreciate that, because
Yeah.
it does the same trick, and it sounds less pompous. But people have this notion that if they add words, they sound more academic, more official, more formal. But then they may end up with very clumsy constructions. Yeah. So all this has something to contribute to good writing even. But especially in conversations, we notice if a rule is broken. And if we go now to the courtroom and think about what happens there in the courtroom, Grice's maxims apply there as well. And they are like formally acknowledged, like what you have to do before you give a witness statement, for instance. You have to swear that I am going to tell the truth.
Yeah.
The whole truth.
Nothing but the truth.
Nothing but the truth. Exactly. So I'm not going to violate Grice's maxim of quality. I'm going to be telling the truth and not just something that I think I might know. The maxim of quantity, nothing but the truth. So don't tell more and tell the whole truth. Make your conversational contribution as informative as required, but not too informative. Be relevant. The judge is really quick to tell you if you are in the witness stand and if you are asked a question by the prosecutor or whoever, and you reply with an answer that is not relevant. So you guide it directly, very quickly, and not always kindly to being relevant. That's not relevant. And there's this, attorneys say irrelevant. So, and then the maxim of manner, you will also be notified very briefly if you are obscure, if you are ambiguous, if you are not brief, and if you are not orderly. So people will ask clarification questions and so on. Let's so there are in the courtroom situation where this is kind of like exaggeratingly important that people don't go there and lie. Of course, people do that too, but it's considered a crime of sorts. So if we leave the courtroom and think about another situation, that a teenager comes home at 3 a.m. And the mother is sitting there in the living room or peering through the window, like, when is he going to be home? And the first question, of course, by the mother is 3 a.m. Saturday morning. Where have you been? And the teenager says, what is the likely answer?
I have no idea. I've never had a curfew.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of experience in it.
So this is a violation against the curfew in this case too. And so if the teenager says, mom says, where have you been? I've been so worried. And the kid says, out. Okay, is this a violation against the maxim of quality? No, it is true. The kid was out. But it's a violation against the maxim of quantity because the mother knows that, you've been out. I've been waiting for you to come in for hours. And it's against the make your conversational contribution as informative as required. The mom wants to know with whom, where, and why have you been gone so long. And of course, it's also a violation against it is relevant. It's an relevant answer to a question, but it's violating all these other some of these other maxims. It's against the maxim of manner because it's obscure, even ambiguous. Out can be many different things. It is too brief. It's brief but too brief, and these don't really apply there. But in that particular situation, the politicians they violate these all the time when. For instance, Bill Clinton was inquired about the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He violated most of Grice's maxims by being obscure and being ambiguous and avoiding answering, not being relevant, answering something, saying something like, we have important things to do in this country and not to discuss this particular issue. I did not have sexual encounters with that woman is obscure. Because how do you define a sexual encounter, and so and I'm not saying that Bill Clinton is not the only politician, because politicians from left or right, they when they are asked uncomfortable questions, they will violate the maxims, one or more, very likely. Yes.
So I think this might be like a cool topic for someone. I don't know if I do it, but I was wondering how clickbait articles would fall under this, because technically they're not false, they're headlines, but they lead you to believe something that's not true. I saw one a few days ago that was oh, Hannah Montana and Britney Spears had a feud, and I was oh, what did Miley Cyrus do to Britney Spears? And then I clicked on the article, and it was Hannah Montana's official account, and it had nothing to do with Miley Cyrus. So I was well, that was kind of
I have noticed the same thing. I was just very recently thinking about it, because the goal of those articles is not to further the conversation, a communication between the reader and the writer of the article, or whoever sponsors that article. The goal is to lure people there, to click on that article, and I've done that so many times and then you're why am I even reading this? Because I wanted to read about what the title was.
Yeah.
I think that would also be a really neat project of how they violate, because which maxim do they violate most blatantly?
I think it would have to be either quantity or the obscurity.
The obscurity, yes, and then also relevance in that particular situation, because it's in a way it's lying.
Yeah.
It's not relevant. What you read is not relevant to the reason why you were there, because your contribution there is, okay, this triggered me to want to know more about this title, and that's your question, and then the answer, the article itself is not relevant, so that would be a violation, and it's obscure, ambiguous, so yeah, I think that would be a neat project to look at those. I have been really annoyed because I don't know why I became really interested in Meghan and Harry, and now
everywhere.
Everything's been said about it. There's really very little new about it, but people, the articles are just kind of trying to lure you that as if there's something new, and it's the same old pictures, nothing new. So
I think the thing that most frustrated me with that topic was I think they had